I'll say, hi, good evening, everyone, and everyone on Zoom as well. Here, I know we'll bring chairs here in the back. You guys want? It's great to have everyone with us, and welcome back to Cantor Shifman. It's always wonderful, and I think your first time teaching with us in the past couple of years since your retirement from B'nai Yeshurim. But we're so excited to have you, and I know everyone is here, and I know many others who weren't able have already told me they're looking forward to watching on YouTube after, and always a pleasure. So we'll turn it over. Cantor Shifman, thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Nice to see so many friendly faces again. Obviously, a lot of memories in this building. So nice to see. This is kind of a new addition for me, actually, to see such a big screen. But hi to everybody on Zoom. Nice to see you all. So when Rabbi Josh invited me to teach, I wanted to find some subject matter that we all can relate to. Because sometimes it's not a knock on teachers, but sometimes the subject matter is sometimes a little bit obscure, or unless you're super involved in liturgy or the ongoings of certain texts, it doesn't relate to as much. So tonight's inspired by Passover, actually. And don't worry, I'm not going to make you work any harder. You put away your dishes, you're catching your breath. But it's fascinated me for some time. And one of the elements I enjoy about teaching is always being that I have to research myself. It's not a given that you just wake up in the morning and you just show up. So I wanted to focus on wine. Now, for full disclosure, I'm not a wine connoisseur, and I'm not going to tell you how you taste your wines or what wines you should eat with your dinners, but I want to give you a Jewish approach to significance of what wine means, why it's so important. So we're going to try to focus on a couple core issues tonight and see if we can hit on them, and hopefully we'll all walk away with something that we didn't know this evening. So we use wine at all of our major life cycles, pretty much, when you think about it. You got Friday night, Shabbat lunch again, Havdalah Saturday night, all of the three festivals. You have basically at almost every life cycle event, they really use wine. So why is wine always at the forefront? What is the significance? I'm going to give you one that probably you don't know, just a little trivia bit. Why do we say l'chaim? What's that about? Every time you have a shot and and if you're in the fine booze committee, as some people that look around this room are, you say it multiple times. But what is this all about, saying every time either you chink your cups together and you say l'chaim, or you just salute someone? There's a significance to saying l'chaim, which means life. So we're going to basically touch on all of those points tonight. I'm going to show you also there's a duality between wine. And that what I mean by that is where wine was used in the proper sanctified manner. And we have numerous stories in the Torah and in the prophets and beyond where wine was not used correctly. And basically the point of intoxication, and there were disastrous results as a result of using the wine in the way it was not meant to be. So let's start with Friday night, we sanctify the Kiddush, right? You're supposed to. So I want to teach you just a couple of ongoing laws. So basically, as you know, the Kiddush was done on a Friday night in the service. Now, what most people aren't aware of is you have to do it yet again at home again. Just because you heard Kiddush in the main sanctuary doesn't count for your meal. You have to do Kiddush over your meal. The reason why Kiddush initially was done because people were very poor. And that was the only place where they would hear Kiddush. So I'm sure you heard stories from Eastern Europe and beyond where people would even sleep in the shul. They would take a bench, there'd be a fireplace, and they had nowhere to go, but at least they would hear Kiddush in the shul. And we have Kiddush Friday night, and every time you do the Kiddush, you have to sanctify. It's making already a sanctified day, if you will. Shabbat is the holiest day of the week. and you're adding additional sanctity with the blessing and the wine. So I'd like to basically draw you back to, we have to go back all the way to Genesis at this point. And then we're going to start to talk about all the different points when we do use wine. So there's a lot of discussion when Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden. And God said, the world is your oyster. Sorry, that's just an expression. I know it's not code. The world is your oyster. And as such, anything is yours for the taking. Just don't eat from the tree of knowledge. So the snake, who is the slyest of all the creatures, the snake basically, and we won't get to subject for a different time, but the snake was not happy with his partner and he desired Eve. I'll leave it at that. And when the snake engaged in a discussion with Eve, the snake said, you know the reason why you can't eat from the tree of knowledge? Because you'll become like God. And God doesn't want you to become like God. You'll have this additional knowledge and you'll become like God, and therefore you ought not to do it. Eve, in her discussion with him, added to the prohibition. The prohibition was, do not eat from the tree. She said that we're not allowed to touch the tree. We know at the outset the snake was created with arms and legs and had the power of speech. And the snake was very sly and he nudges her into the tree. And says, look, nothing happened. The same way when you touch the tree, nothing's going to happen. You can also eat from the tree. And she's convinced and she goes ahead and eats from the tree. Now she recognizes that she's done something wrong, so she goes and convinces Adam to partake also. To the point of our discussion, the rabbis in the Talmud want to know what fruit was the tree of knowledge. So there's a whole course of discussion. We're going to go with one of the mainstay discussions and conclusions that it was none other than the vine. So what happened when they both ate from the tree of knowledge, the Eitz Hadat? Immediately, God asked Adam, where are you? He uses a very strong term, and the term is ayeka. Now, does God not know where he is? Of course he does. Ayeka means, where are you in regards to me? What have you done? You've been here 5 minutes and you've already sinned. So essentially, he punishes Adam, Eve, and the snake. And immediately, from the outset of violating God's prohibition, death is brought into the world. So we're going to use that as a main core of tonight's subject, which is every time that we are able to sanctify wine, it's making a repairing of the original sin. Now, I think there's a misnomer where we're all caught up in the world that we live in, that if I do wrong to you, then I can apologize and make it right, and we call it a day. That's not exactly how it works with God. There's punishment, but God doesn't give the full breadth of God's punishment. Therefore, some sins carry forward generationally. And we see it time and time again. For example, why do we fast on Tisha B'Av? How does it help us fasting now help recreate the temples? But there's a sin that led to the fasting, and every time you fast, it's making a repair. If you will, metaphorically speaking, there's these sparks of God that have been dispersed across the world when we have sins. And every time we make a repair, it's a way for God to get some of his sparks back, if you will. So every time we sanctify wine, it's a way to make a repairment of the original sin with Adam and Eve. So we're going to use that just as a ground point of tonight's discussion. Now, going back to some of the things that we use wine in a sanctified manner, we use wine at the Kiddush, as we mentioned, lunch in the morning, and again at the Havdalah service. It's one of the several items we use at the Havdalah. You're supposed to fill your cup and at the Havdalah to the brim, even overflowing. It's called a kos shel bracha. It's a blessing, a cup of blessing. We want the blessing to overflow like your cup of wine is. Now, what most people don't do that do Havdalah is you're not supposed to blow out the candle. You're supposed to take the very flame and put it back into the wine. So if you think about it, we start Shabbat with lighting of candles, and we have wine, and we take out Shabbat with flame and again with wine. Two elements of sanctity, very, very high sanctity. We have a wedding ceremony. And at a wedding ceremony, when the groom and bridegroom are standing nervously under the chuppah, we have 2 cups of wine. 1 cup, if you remember the original process, that we were engaged for 11 months up to a year, and then they would get married a year later. We do it all at one time. So there's 2 cups of wine at the initial ceremony, and then what we know as a Sheva bracha, which is the 7 blessings, but I'm not speaking about that takes place immediately at the wedding. I'm talking about at the very first meal. At the end of the very first meal, there's actually, unfortunately, we don't do enough of this, but it's supposed to be, again, using wine, but multiple cups. So the individual that leads the Birkat Hamazon has his cup or her cup. And we have an additional cup for the bride and the bridegroom, and a 3rd cup for the crowd that stays around. And we take these wines and we actually mix them in one into the other. So you get multitudes of blessing over and over. At a Brit Milah, we have wine also, where, thank God, the baby has it. It's anesthesia for the baby, right? You give the baby multiple dippings of the wine as it's wailing along, but we have wine. So I want to tell you, one of my early years at B'nai Yeshurun with Irv Lewis in blessed memory, we had a bris on Yom Kippur. Now, what are you supposed to do if you have a bris on Yom Kippur? You can't push it off. The 8th day of the bris overrides Yom Kippur. You don't push it off. The only reason you push it off, it's not for convenience, it's for medical issues. If the doctor or the moel determines that there's a major issue, you wait till it's safe for the baby. So in this case, it was a full go, and you had to do wine. Now, you're not allowed to make a blessing and then not culminate, because then you violate one of the 10 commandments, which is, can't take God's name in vain. So you'd find a kid under the age of bar mitzvah who's not fasting in the first place, maybe use grape juice, and then he or she can drink from the wine. This way, you don't violate making a blessing in vain. Not too long ago, we just celebrated Purim. Purim is really the only life cycle where the rabbis say you can go over the top. Right? You're supposed to imbibe. No, it can be a problem. But the idea is that it says in the book of Psalms, wine gladdens the heart, makes a person happy. The rabbi said, due to the victory of Purim, I'll show you in a couple of minutes how it's also related to wine, that you should really be intoxicated to the point where you don't know the difference between cursed Haman and blessed Mordechai. Now, if you take the names in Hebrew, cursed Haman, Arur Haman, and Baruch Mordechai, the numerology actually is the same, believe it or not. So the rabbis are very much against normally going over the top and losing yourself where you have no clarity and you make a clown out of yourself, or God forbid, do worse. That they said on Purim, you should, some rabbis say, drink more than you usually do and then take a nap. Why should you take a nap? Because when you're sleeping, you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. So mission accomplished. So you can accomplish that in a safe way also by just taking a nap. Now, the story of Purim unfolds through wine. We're told Achashverosh gets absolutely intoxicated and thinks it's a great idea that his queen at the present time should come before him. I'll just say, not to be crass, in a birthday suit. She should be before him. And she refuses to, and he has her killed. And now we know how the whole story unfolds. So towards the end of Purim, we have a bookend where Esther has invited Haman to a meal, but it's a wine meal. And she gets Achashverosh in a good mindset until Haman trips and falls on her. And also to the point where she points out that this man's trying to kill us. And everything comes full circle. Through the miracle of wine, he decides Haman has to be hung with his sons. And so we see how wine is instrumental, not just in the way we fulfill our holiday each and every year by drinking mass amounts of wine. We also see in the story itself how salvation came through wine. I want to tell you that not in this synagogues, but in some of the Orthodox synagogues, they had a major problem with something called Kiddush clubs. And the Kiddush club was people would go out during the Torah service or right after, and they would have not wine, but very, very strong alcohol. And by the time they got to Musaf, if they even made it back, they were absolutely hammered. And I got to the point, in all seriousness, where the rabbis disallowed it. And I was reading in preparation for this, a story in one of the congregations where they were so upset with their rabbi for putting his foot down, they got him fired. Probably not the kind of shul you want to be at in the first place. But everything has to be done in the right way, under the mode of sanctification, bringing joy to Shabbat, but not at the point where you lose yourself. Now, in the story that just happened 10 days ago, 11, if you count first night, Pesach. Pesach, we have 4 cups of wine. Each cup of wine represents our expression of redemption that we find in the Torah, how God took us out of Egypt. And we even have a 5th cup of wine. Now, we don't drink the 5th cup of wine. That's the cup of Elijah. So what's the connection of the cup of Elijah to the Passover story? We know he comes, right? Well, I'm still yet to see evidence in the cup of wine I pour where he's actually drinking. It's gone down a little, it's receded. But we invite him because Elijah is supposed to bring tidings of the redemption. According to the rabbis and in the Talmud, the redemption is actually going to happen on Passover. So when we open the door, we rise up, and we invite Elijah into our home. We have the 5th cup representing that we want to be good hosts. We want to invite Elijah in, but we're hoping that this is the night he's coming to say, get your bags packed, that's happening. So that's why we have the 5th cup, but yet again, another holiday where wine is front and center. There's an agricultural holiday known as Tu B'Shvat, the holiday of the trees, and the Sephardim have a Seder. And you guys do it here also, I know. I've been at a few that have been done at the synagogue many times, where you get the 7 species of fruits that are listed in the Torah, but you also have cups of wine and different colors to represent the different times of the year. There's a host of reasons why they use, but that's more of a Sephardi custom. There is going back to the times of the temple and the tabernacle, after a sacrifice was brought, was known for the wine of libation. And there were certain channels that were built in under the altar, and they actually would pour wine on the altar. And then they'd go to a chamber well below the altar and collect there. And we don't understand that we bring a sacrifice. God doesn't need our sacrifice, right? We don't believe God. We believe God has great joy from the sacrifices that we brought. But the same way wine was brought also on the altar, believe it or not. So wine has many, many, many values. And at Birkat HaMazon, the grace of meals, you could also do it with a cup of wine in hand and then make the blessing to follow. So anywhere you have an opportunity to sanctify God's name using wine, which represents holiness. However, it also represents, unfortunately, the first sin. So we're able to make this repair every time that we use it. Now, unfortunately, as you start to go through the Torah and post-Torah, we're going to see numerous examples of how it was misused. So there's 10 generations between Adam and Noah. Noah is given the very difficult task, 10 generations later, of building this humongous ark, getting the species of animals on there. And then God's going to destroy the world. People don't take to doing repentance. And God floods and he destroys the world. Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their wives, were tasked with feeding these animals pretty much round the clock. It was 24/7. You know, all of the animals, some are nocturnal and some are some of the opposite. And they had to feed them day and night. It was like a full-fledged job. Finally, when the ark does settle, he does bring a sacrifice, but one of the strange things that he does is basically he plants a vineyard. And miraculously, what happens with that vineyard, the same day that he planted, it matures. And of course, you can't blame the poor guy. He wants to blow off some steam, and he drinks, and he drinks, and he drinks, to the point where he doesn't know where he is, and he's lying in his tent, pretty much unaware of anything going around him. His grandson spots him first, Canaan, and goes and gets his father, Ham. Now, Ham was not one of the good guys, and the Talmud says he did 1 or 2 things to his father. He basically looked at the equation that they had in front of them, which was that right now we own 33% of the world. The 3 sons, when our parents go, we're going to get 1/3 of the world. I don't want my father to have any more children. And he takes matters into his own hands and he castrates him. That's okay. Maybe someone's got a question for me. The other thing that he did, according to the Talmud, which is a little bit more, not for the faint of heart, but some say that he sodomized his father. And he actually curses the next generation because he couldn't curse his son because of his behavior. Now, it's hard to correlate because if you look at the beginning of Noah, the first verse says, Ele todot Noah. I should ask Michael, it's his bar mitzvah portion. Each tzaddik, haya b'dorotav, he was a man of his generation. How do you go from that scene, fast forward into a guy that's lying in his tent, absolutely intoxicated? So the rabbis explain that the second go around, 2.0 of the world, God blessed it even more so than the first time. Therefore, in actuality, he drank the same amount that he normally would, but the alcohol was that much more potent that it got to the point where he didn't know where he was, and obviously he paid a major price. Fast forwarding to Abraham and his nephew Lot. Abraham and his nephew Lot were together and they amassed much flock. They had a lot of cattle and sheep to the point where there was a lot of infighting between the shepherds. And it got to the point where they couldn't feed on the same lands and it was too vast. So Abraham tells his nephew, why don't you choose where you want to go and you go your way and I go mine. So his nephew looks around and he chooses Sodom, which was a very fertile land, not a good group of people by any stretch, but he chooses it for his crops and the animals, etc. And he goes there. When after Abraham was circumcised, 3 angels came to see Abraham. One came to heal him. One came to tell him that in a year from now, which was actually during Passover, they would have their firstborn son, him and Sarah, Isaac. And a 3rd angel is tasked with destroying Sodom and Gomorrah because the sins were so wicked in God's eyes. And the angels go to Sodom, and Lot happens to see them, and he did pick up some good habits from his uncle. And he does something that's forbidden to do there. You weren't allowed to show hospitality in Sodom. And he invites them into his home. He wants to he tells his wife to make some food, and he's lacking in salt, and she goes to one of the neighbors asking for salt, and then what do you need it for? We don't use it here. And then the word gets out that he's hosting people. Most of the town ascends on his door, his house, and he does something inexplicable. He comes out, says, leave my guests alone, who I know for 5 minutes, but I'll give you my 2 daughters. Do anything you want to with them. But they're not interested in the 2 daughters. They wanted his guests. So God smites them with blindness, and they can't find the door. They can't get into the house. The next day, they're given very specific instructions to leave immediately. God is going to destroy the entire cities, and they're not to look back. So Lot and his 2 daughters and his wife leave. They have to leave, or they take very few belongings with them. And his wife does look back, as you know, and she turns to a pillar of salt. Him and his 2 daughters go on, and they end up in a cave. And the 2 daughters are under the impression now that the whole world has been destroyed, not Sodom and Gomorrah. They only know what's in front of them. This was long before there was an internet and telegrams or anything like that. They think the whole world is destroyed. In the cave that they're in, I cannot tell you how it came to be, but guess what was there? Wine. The eldest daughter says it's our job to populate the world. So she gets her father intoxicated. She gets pregnant from her father. She tells her sister, to do the same. You have a moral obligation to populate the world. And she does. Now, the first daughter was not so modest. She calls her child Moab. That sound familiar? You may have just, you may be ready to hear all about it. It's coming up in a few weeks, about 7 weeks. Ruth, the Moabite. Moabite is a contraction of 2 words. Moabite is Me Avi. This child is from my father. So one of the trick questions were, who was a father and a grandfather at the same time? He was. But out of that relationship came Ruth. And from Ruth, 4 generations later came King David. And Naomi came on the other side with the Ammonites. But we see yet again how the power of wine can cause catastrophic results, and they're not allowed to marry into the faith. Now we're going to fast forward into now Joseph. And there are numerous examples. I had to pick some due to time constraints. I want to make sure you get home before next Pesach, so I want to keep it within an hour. When Joseph was the chosen one, if you will, his father made him this technicolor coat, which I'm going to speak a little bit about next week. He showed outward favoritism to Joseph. Joseph was a dreamer, and he had numerous dreams, and he would share them with his brothers, angering them further. He also would tattletale on his brothers, and what he actually was telling his father was not true. That being said, Jacob sends out his sons. He keeps Joseph at home so he shouldn't get his hands dirty. And he sends out the 10 brothers to take the flock out and feed them. And inexplicably, he says to Joseph on his own, go find your brothers and see how they're doing. So he does. And when they see him coming from a distance, they get together and they say, all right, let's put an end to this once and for all. And they grab him. They initially are going to kill him. And they throw him into a pit. Very interesting to note, when they sat in the pit, when he was crying in the pit, begging them to take them out, they felt comfortable in their decision because he was telling things to the father that wasn't true. And they decided that his time had come. They sit down and eat a meal. And at the meal, wine is served. Now, the rabbis tell us at that particular moment, God said, you're going to decide one of my children's lives around a meal. I'm going to have that happen generations later. So we go back to the story of Purim. where Achashverosh and Haman, and through the liquor, made a decision not too long after that, that the time had come to destroy the Jews. That being said, Joseph is sold. The brothers have compassion at the last minute. Judah, the fourth brother, is the one that has the leadership skills. And they listen to him and they sell him as a slave. He makes his way down to Egypt. I'm going to speak about some of the stops next week, but I want to speak about his last stop, which is in the jail. Now, when he's in the jail, he finds favor. Everywhere he went, he was blessed. He found favor with anyone around him. And you got the famous dream with the butler and the baker. We're going to just focus on the butler. He saw the two of them one morning and they looked ashen. They looked like something was bothering them. And they told him the dreams. And what by the way, incidentally, the butler was put in jail because, ties to wine again, Pharaoh's goblet had a fly inside of it. So he punished him, said, "You're removed from your position," he threw him in jail. So he has this dream, and basically the three vines that he sees in the dream, and they're being squeezed into a cup for Pharaoh, the grapes and the vines. We know from the rabbinic lore that one has to be very careful how you interpret a dream, because many times the way you interpret a dream, that's the way it turns out. So Joseph tells him, "I've got good news for you. The three vines represent 3 days from now, Pharaoh's going to have his birthday, and you're going to get reinstated." And he says to him, at the time, when this happens, "Remember me," says those two words. "Make sure to tell Pharaoh about me in jail, that I did a good thing." He gets punished for saying those two words because he's put his faith in someone other than God, and he has to stay another 2 years in jail. In those 2 years that the butler was out of jail, he does not remember him. And then we know Pharaoh has his famous dreams, which are on the Nile River. Remember, with the emaciated cows eating the healthy cows, and they still remain emaciated. He has two sets of dreams, and nobody can interpret the dreams. And shortly after, then it dawns upon this guy, the butler. Oh, by the way, there was this young guy, calls him a Na'ar. A Na'ar is not such a flattering term. A Na'ar is almost like a fool. A young guy and a slave. Use those two terms. Pharaoh is very intrigued because he hasn't gotten a satisfactory answer to interpret his dreams. And he sends for Joseph. And then we know it's all history beyond that. Joseph does interpret his dreams. And beyond that, he becomes the viceroy of Egypt. Just as a side note, not connected to this per se, but why would the butler not have any appreciation for what Joseph did for him? Why did it diminish him by calling him almost like a fool, a young child, a lad, and a slave? So there's a story told about the Baal Shem Tov. He's a 17th century Hasidic rabbi who started the Hasidic movement. And there was a man who had a daughter who couldn't walk. Any kind of treatment that they tried failed. And people said, there's this famous rabbi, he's a miracle worker. But be prepared to pay him. They made up slander about the Baal Shem Tov. Be prepared to pay him if you want a blessing. So he saves up as much money as he can. And basically, he brings his daughter to the Baal Shem Tov in a wheelchair. And the Baal Shem Tov is immersed in his book, studying. And finally looks up, and the guy just throws the money on the table, says, "Heal my daughter." Very disrespectful. The Baal Shem Tov takes a bag of money, throws it out the window. Needless to say, the miracle has already happened because his daughter gets up out of the wheelchair and runs out and starts collecting all the coins and threw out the window. And the man got and said, let's quickly get our money and leave. And that's the way of people that don't have appreciation. The way the people that don't have appreciation, like in the story of Joseph, is that people always credit themselves for all good that happens to them. And of course, they blame other people. So a very interesting thing to note about Joseph ended up without the help of this guy in the end, the way God had wanted. A very painful story we see in the book of Leviticus, when Aaron has already been anointed high priest. And in the tabernacle, there was a section only allowed for him to go in. His two sons decide on their own, without permission from Aaron, Moses, and of course God, and they try to bring a sacrifice. And it's called Eish Zara, a strange fire was brought. God immediately takes the fire and shoots it back down, and he kills them immediately. And the rabbis tell us that they were intoxicated when they brought the sacrifices. Now, the point is they weren't alcoholics, so what were they trying to do? So it's something like in the 60s, if you remember, with acid and some of these breakthrough drugs, people tried to reach a stage of consciousness within. So they wanted to reach a certain state of consciousness to go before God, but they did it the wrong way, and they lost their lives on account, once again, of using the fire in the wrong way. And the rabbis derive from here one step further that not only were all priests never allowed to bring sacrifices if they were intoxicated, a general average person, like most of the people in this room I'm looking around, that are non-Kohanim, are not allowed to pray when you're intoxicated. That's an affront to God. So if you think you come in there and you're a little bit sloshed and you're slurring your words, but I got to daven. Well, guess what? It's better to miss the davening than to show up and pray to the King of Kings in an intoxicated state, or any form of drugs. Any kind of drugs that's going to impair your thinking, you're not allowed to pray in such a state of mind. Oh, by the way, I should say, I've been going on for some time. Are there any questions? Feel free to fire away. I'm giving you sensory overload here, I know, but does anyone have any questions or thoughts up to this point?
I have about the last thing that you pointed out, you're not allowed to pray if you take a drug that's mind altering. Now, there are a fair number of antidepressants,
Well,
anxiolytics.
so let me clarify. Yeah, so things that help you for depression, anxiety, a person is still lucid. I'm talking about to some extent.
There's a debate about how lucid you are. Take some of those medicines.
I guess that's a good point to some extent. I would say the difference being that's out of necessity. And if the person has to take those drugs to function on day to day versus somebody that does it for recreational use. So somebody that just wants to, I didn't see you back there. Somebody that just wants to drink or get high for whatever reason, because they like to, you're not allowed to pray like that. Something where there's a necessity, that's your day-to-day functionability, how you can function in society. I'm sure an exception will be made under those rules. I'm just talking about somebody that does it strictly for recreational use. Or like there's people that go to a Kiddush club and they come back from Musaf and let alone can't put one foot together, let alone two for the meeting. That's what we're speaking about.
Cantor,
Yes, sir.
what about, is there an exception for Simchat Torah?
Yeah.
So Simchat Torah so Simchat Torah could be a problem. That's why some people do the drinking after davening, not as much as what we do. We took some liberty here. If I remember correctly, all birthdays between January and March, and everyone come up, and then one of the clergy has to stand by there, and before you leave, somebody grabs you back there. Simchat Torah, many people will drink after the service is over, so they'll dance initially, or at night after the service. But generally, it's the same rule of thumb, because if you get to Musaf, so you think about what the net effect of what's gained. What's gained is you're very festive, let alone, I'm sure you guys are still doing the honorees. Khatan Torah and Khatan Breshit, by the time you get to Musaf, you don't even know who they honor. That's how much you've had to drink. So I think at some point in time, you leave it for after the davening, because I don't think there's any exception to daven in any manner. If you're really well to the point of you don't even know what you're saying anymore and slurring your words, etc.
You mentioned that everybody except the Kohanim.
All Kohanim were not allowed to imbibe before they brought sacrifices. But what I mentioned is the rabbis derived from there about doing it before prayer, because we know prayer has taken the substitute of sacrifices.
Mhm.
So people that pray now, it's as though you brought the sacrifice. But you're allowed to drink, of course. One of the other things we're told, you should know, there's a big mitzvah for mourners to be having wine in the home to help them cope with the loss. And the rabbis go into a great discussion of how much should be enough. So there's different phases in the mourning process. So when someone first loses someone, it's kind of you're in nowhere's land. You're not a mourner yet. You can't say Kaddish because you haven't done the burial. But you have a status where you're quasi-mourner. So you're not allowed to drink at that point. But once you've come home and you officially started Shiva, the rabbi say in Talmud, it was a mitzvah to give the mourner to cope with the pain of the loss. Now, as you know, and we've all been to many Shiva homes, sometimes it takes on like a party-like atmosphere. And you got to be very careful where, you're there to uplift the spirits of the mourner, but then at some point in time, people are crowding around the bar. If they got hard liquor served, and it's kind of a very fine line yet again, which is really the duality of what we're speaking about. The fine line of raising the spirits of the mourners to the point where it becomes frivolous. That's really a very, very fine line. Now, when the Jews are marching through the desert in the book of Numbers, we have the king Balak is very worried for his safety, for his kingdom, and he hires a prophet, non-Jewish prophet by the name of Bilam, if you remember the story, to curse the Jews. So the combination of these two were very lethal. One of them knew what curses to use, the king, and the prophet knew, according to rabbinic lore, every day there's a time where God gets angry, and if you lock into that specific time, it's not good. And he knew. So to try to put the two of them together. And he said, the Jewish power is not through the physical strength, it's the power of prayer. That's why they're so successful. So let's curse them and take that away from them. So everywhere, Bilam, the prophet, was warned not to curse the Jews, and God said, you will not be successful. Finally, after multiple sacrifices and spousing blessings, the ultimate blessing comes out. God takes his words and twists them. And we made it part of our prayer book, part of our liturgy, the morning service, which is Ma Tovu, how goodly are tents of Jacob. And the king is furious. He said, I didn't bring you here to bless the people. I hired you to curse them. So Bilam had one more idea. And this idea was, we're going to get the Moabite woman to set up camps around the Jewish camps. There's hundreds of thousands of Jews out of Egypt. They moved very slowly. They will have their wares. Get them to seduce the men and worship their idols. And one of the vehicles that they used when the men went to shop, once they got them in the tents, was wine. They got them drunk, and they got them to worship their god, which is called the Baal Peor. The very strange, it's not me, so don't shoot the messenger. The form of worship was defecating in front of the idol. Sorry, I'm not making it up. It's not from me. I'm not taking any Hollywood license here. That's what it says in the Torah. But they were successful because, again, wine was used in an inappropriate manner. and they lost their wherewithal and they worshiped a God other than our God. And the Jews were punished with a plague, and 24,000 people died. And Aaron's grandson stopped the plague. Well, one of the people from the tribe of Shimon and one of the Moabite princes were in the tent having an orgy. He pretended to be, wanted to be participating, and he hid a spear inside of his robe. And he basically stuck it through both of them. And he walked around the encampment and said, this is what happens when you violate God's word. And then the plague stopped immediately. Now, some things about wine I want to just tell you, going back to the mysteries of wine. The actual word for wine in Hebrew is yayin. The word for secret in Hebrew, sod. Very good. So if you take sod, the numerical value of sod is 70. You take the numerical value of yayin and is 70. They both have the same numerical values, which tells us there's many secrets that underlie the power of how powerful wine is. Wine happens to be one of the 7 species, right, that we learned to use in the land of Israel. We're also told that the 70 faces of Torah interpretation, Shivim Panim La Torah. So if somebody uses wine the right way, you'll be benefiting some of it. And the rabbis use many metaphors in the Torah and in the Talmud, and they liken a sage to old wine. Right? We say the older the wine, the more mature the wine, as opposed to going to somebody that's immature and doesn't quite have the knowledge. A sage is compared to a very good wine. We have another commandment in the Torah. It's about the Nazareth law. If somebody takes on a vow to become a Nazareth, that means that you're not going to cut your hair. You cannot come in contact with the dead bodies. And you have to stay away from all grape products, not just actually wine, but any kind of a grape product. So if somebody takes on, and the rabbi says it's very praiseworthy, because what do you gain by staying away from wine? You're taking away a luxury. So you're giving yourself self-discipline. There's a whole story what you do on Shabbat and what you do on Passover if somebody's a Nazarite. But that being said, they say it's very praiseworthy. Some of the vows are for 30 days, some are more long-term. The one I want to focus on tonight is Samson. Samson was a Nazarite. I don't know if you knew this. Samson was a Nazarite, but because God made him a Nazarite and he didn't take the vow on his own, Samson was a warrior and he violated one of the cords, which is he had to kill Philistines. Matter of fact, we're told he killed Philistines with a jawbone of a donkey. He used it as a weapon. He got so thirsty that God made a miracle happen and he allowed him to open the jawbone and water to come into his mouth. But one of the misnomers about the story of Samson is people think he had magical hair. His hair was no more magical than the little I have left back here. I have nothing up front to speak about, but the back that I have, his hair was not magical. His wife was Delilah, who was a Philistine, and daily she would try to ply him for information. How are you so strong? How are you so strong? And he would tell her, as we say, in Mamalash, a Baba Maisa. You know what a Baba Maisa? He didn't quite trust her. He would throw her off track. And finally, he told her that I'm a Nazarite. And if I violate my code, I'll lose my powers. So she waits for him to fall asleep and she cuts his hair. Once she cuts his hair, as you know, he loses his powers. They capture him, the Philistines, they blind him. And, towards the end of his life, he has one more chance to make amends when he's in a temple where there's a holiday. And he asks for his hands to be placed on the pillars, and he kills 3,000 Philistines along with himself by pushing down the building. but had nothing to do with magic or hair. It had to do with breaking the Nazareth vow. There was a king generations later by the name of Achav, and his wife was Jezebel or Izebel. She was a very wicked woman, and she tried to persecute all the prophets. And one day she saw her husband, his face was downtrodden, and he looked like in a stupor, and she said, well, what's going on? Well, this guy's got a vineyard that I really want, but he didn't have children. So she said, what's the problem? Well, the problem is it's his and not mine. You know, we can make that problem go away very easily. We'll have him killed, and then the king's always first in line to inherit if there's no children. And that's what they did. And the rabbis came up with an expression based upon that event, which is, you can't show up in court as a murderer and say, I want to inherit. Can't have it both ways. Now, as we start to wrap it up, I want to get to one of the original questions I posed to you, which is, what is this whole business about l'chaim? So there's a number of sources cited for. One source is going back to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, if you remember, is the great sage that didn't become a sage until he was 40 years old. He was one of those that were killed by the Romans in public. They flayed his skin. And if you're still around on about, I forget what time you do it, about 1 o'clock on Yom Kippur Day, I would say, when you do the martyrology, he's one of the 10 rabbis mentioned. When his son was married, people came to wish the proud father Mazel Tov, and you do like a shot for them, and you'd say, L'chaim. This is quoted over 2,000 years ago. Now, another interesting thing I found was when the tribunal of judges would meet to decide somebody's fate of capital punishment, they would use a term that we use at the beginning of Kiddush, which is Savri Meranan Merabatai. Savri means attention, gentlemen. Now, what do you say when they go Savri Meranan Merabatai? You say? You know why you say l'chaim? That's how the judges would announce their verdict. So if the person was allowed to live, they'll say l'chaim. And if you're supposed to die, they would say l'mavet. And of course, we're all about life, unless you're a morbid person and you're just thinking about death all the time, but we want to think in the positive. There's another explanation by the Tzemach Tzedek, who's one of the original Chabad rabbis. I think it was the number 2 or 3 in the lineage of the 7. And he said, within the word yayin, what are the first 2 letters? God's name, the Yud Yud. So when you have people drinking together, but not in a frivolous manner, but in a communal way, in a way that's social and your well-being, obviously I would think you're not drinking with somebody you don't want to be in the company. Unless you put something in his drink, right? But you're not going to be drinking with anyone that's not good company. So in essence, when you're sitting down, you're bringing blessing to God, because as the psalmist says, Hine ma tovu manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. How wonderful is it to be sitting amongst our brothers and sisters together. So when you drink together, under those circumstances, you say l'chaim, because that's what you're doing. You're perpetuating life. You're living life with a zest and the way God wanted, which is communally. We're told that there's one final wine that's going to come at the end of time. And that's not going to be until the Messiah comes, where we all will have that wine together. And that's called the Yain HaMeshumar. God's put it away, and we will all toast in one another's well-being. We'll be in a utopian society, because Lord knows we're living in a terrible time now. I don't want to put a damper on it unless we're drinking wine and would forget what we're saying. But if we need it more so than ever to have optimism because of the time that we're living in, the crazy world, but also specifically what's been happening in Israel, what's happening to Jews in our country and across the world. So a last thought I want to share with you, and I heard this when I was co-officiating a wedding in Florida when I used to be a cantor there. The rabbi turned to the groom and the bridegroom, and he said to them, I want to wish you Geffen. Geffen is the vine, right? The vine, Gimel Pei Nun. So it's actually an acronym, but you need to speak a little bit Yiddish. If not, I'll translate. So the Gimel in Geffen stands for gesund, which is health. The Pei in Geffen stands for parnasa, which is to make a livelihood. And the one that we all strive for is nachas. So that's the ultimate blessing. So I want to wish all of you tonight, Geffen, all of you that are on the board should have Geffen, have only good health. You should not want for anything. You should have comfort in your lives and much nachas from your children, your grandchildren, your significant others, and take joy in that which you do. And then we'll have ultimate Geffen. And I have water, but I'll still say l'chaim.
L'chaim.
Yeshiv Koach.
Thank you.
May I say one thing? And thank you for a beautiful talk. And if anyone has not had a chance to sign the petition to try to get anti-gerrymandering.
That's not the place for it. This isn't the place for politics. This isn't the place for
Please,
politics.
Cantor,
Yes, sir.
did you want to share also what next week?
Next week, we're going to be talking about clothing,
Uh-oh.
but not necessarily the fashion industry. Once again, a disclaimer. But we're going to speak about clothing from the Torah perspective, certain laws that pertain to clothing, and different stories in the Torah and the prophets that speak specifically about clothing and how they interacted with people. One last thing I'll say before we head out tonight is if you cannot make any classes during the series, no one class is a continuum to the next. It's a new class unto its own. So if you miss one class, it's okay. The next class will be a new class on its own. Erev Tov, everyone.
Thank you.